After my wife passed away and my sons kicked me out of the house, I was working as a ride-share driver when I picked up a passenger at City General Hospital. An old man climbed into the back seat and instantly froze, staring straight at me. He asked me in a trembling voice if my name was Vance. I told him it was, and that my name was Leopold Vance. He started to cry and told me he had been looking for my family for 60 years. He took me to an office and opened an old safe, completely covered in dust. His hands shook as he turned the combination dial. He explained that my father had saved his company from bankruptcy back in 1965, but had never received the stock shares he was promised. When he finally opened that safe and showed me the documents, when I saw the accumulated amount of money from decades of growth, I forgot how to breathe. But to understand why that moment simultaneously destroyed and saved me, I need to tell you how I ended up there, driving a cab at 73, without family and without hope. 6 months before that day, I had a life. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. I had a small house, a wife, Patrice, who had been my partner for 45 years, and 2 sons, Moses and Earl, who I thought loved me. Patrice was everything to me. Every morning she made coffee with 2 spoonfuls of sugar. That smell of fresh brewed coffee was my routine, my comfort, my home. When cancer took her in March, in less than 3 months, that smell disappeared forever. And with it, everything I knew vanished. The first days after the funeral were a blur of pain and silence. The house that used to overflow with her laughter now only held echoes. Moses and Earl came to visit for the first few weeks. They brought prepared food and empty words, but I noticed something different in their eyes. They no longer saw me as their father. They saw me as a problem that needed solving. That solution arrived one Tuesday afternoon, exactly 1 month after I buried my wife. Moses knocked on my door with papers in his hand and a cold expression I had never seen before. He made me sit at the kitchen table. He explained that the house was in Patrice's name, and that it now legally belonged to them. They had decided to sell it because they needed the money, for their own families, their own debts. I asked them where they expected me to live. Earl, the younger one, responded without looking me in the eye. He said I should find a small apartment, something I could afford with my Social Security check. My check was for only $400 a month. It barely covered food. I told them so, my voice breaking. Moses shrugged. He said they couldn't support me. They had their own responsibilities. It felt like a knife twisting in my chest. My own children, the boys I carried in my arms, who I drove to school every morning, were throwing me out on the street as if I were nothing. 2 weeks later, I was living in a rented room that cost $300 a month. It was the size of a closet. The walls were a dirty yellow. It smelled of dampness and the neighbors' cigarettes. The window faced an alley piled high with trash. There was no kitchen, just a hot plate and a small refrigerator that hummed constantly. The bathroom was shared with 3 other tenants. The mattress springs dug into my back. It was the only place I could afford, and it still left me with only $100 a month for food. The nights were unbearable. I stayed awake, staring at the stains on the ceiling, listening to the neighbors fighting through the thin walls. I wondered how I had gotten there. 73 years of life, 45 years of marriage, 2 children raised with love, and there I was, alone and abandoned in a room that felt like a cell. I thought about Patrice constantly. I wondered if she could see me from wherever she was. Hunger doesn't spare pride. After 2 weeks of eating only bread and canned beans, I knew I had to do something. I couldn't survive on $100 a month. I signed up as a driver for a rideshare app. I thought nobody would accept me, an old man of 73 competing against young kids. But I was approved in 2 days. They gave me a windshield decal and access to the app. That was it. The first day, I almost got into 3 accidents. My hands sweated on the wheel. Passengers rushed in, some kind, others rude. I tried to concentrate on not getting lost, on not making mistakes. Every time I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw a stranger, a gaunt man with deep, dark circles under his eyes. I had lost over 20 pounds since Patrice's death. I worked 12, sometimes 14 hours a day, from 6 in the morning until 8 at night. My legs swelled so badly, I could barely walk. My back burned with constant pain, but I couldn't stop. Each trip meant $3, $4, or $5. I stopped buying anything unnecessary. No coffee, no meat, just cheap rice, beans, and bread. Sundays were a special torture. They used to be sacred days. Patrice would cook her famous roast chicken. The children would come with their families. The house would fill with laughter. Now, Sundays were just another workday. Another day of picking up strangers and hearing snippets of their happy lives while I died inside. Families going to brunch together. Old couples holding hands. Every trip was a painful reminder of everything I had lost. 4 months passed like this. 4 months of loneliness, exhaustion, and despair. I didn't receive a single call from my sons, not one text. It was as if I had died along with Patrice. There were nights when I considered giving up, but something in me, perhaps the memory of Patrice, forced me to get up every morning and keep going. It was a Thursday afternoon when my life changed forever. I received a ride notification. Pickup at City General Hospital, destination downtown. It was a short trip, probably $10. I usually avoided the hospital because of the traffic, but that day I needed every cent. I accepted the ride and drove to the main entrance. I parked in the pickup zone and waited. 5 minutes passed, then 10. I was about to cancel when I saw an elderly man emerge from the glass doors. He was old, probably my age, but he walked slowly, leaning on a dark wooden cane that looked antique and expensive. He wore a perfectly pressed gray suit, a navy blue tie, and polished shoes. His hair was completely white, slicked back with gel. Everything about him screamed money, class. I got out of the car to help him. I opened the back door and extended my hand. He looked up at me, and in that instant, everything changed. He froze completely still. His face transformed into a mask of absolute shock. His light gray, almost transparent eyes widened immensely. His mouth fell open, and the cane trembled in his hand. I thought he was having a stroke. I asked him if he was feeling all right, if he needed a doctor, but he didn't answer. He just stared at me as if he were seeing a ghost. Finally, he spoke. His voice was raspy, heavy with emotion. He asked me my last name. I was confused, but I answered. I told him my name was Leopold Vance. The moment he heard that name, his eyes welled up with tears, real tears that began to stream down his cheeks. He repeated my surname twice. Vance. Vance. As if it were a magic word. Then he asked me in a broken voice if I knew a man named Hector Vance. I felt the world stop. Hector Vance was my father. He had died 30 years ago. of a heart attack. I told him yes, that Hector had been my father, but that he had passed away a long time ago. The old man squeezed his eyes shut, and more tears fell. He whispered something under his breath that I couldn't hear. Then he opened his eyes and looked at me with an expression that mixed relief, sadness, and guilt. He told me, his voice firm despite the tears, that he had been looking for my family for 60 years. 60 years. I didn't understand anything. I didn't know this man. I had never seen him. But he spoke as if he knew secrets about my family that I didn't. He asked me, please, not to go to the original destination, but to take him to his office. He said he had something he needed to show me, something he had kept for 6 decades, waiting for this moment. Something that had to do with my father and a debt that was never paid. I didn't know what to say. My mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fear. This man, this complete stranger, was crying in front of me, talking about my father as if he had known him intimately, as if he held 60-year-old secrets. I asked him who he was, what he wanted from me. He wiped his tears with a white handkerchief he took from his suit pocket and apologized for his reaction. He told me his name was Alfred, and that what he had to show me would change my life. He begged me to trust him for just 1 more hour. 1 hour of my time, in exchange for answers I'd been waiting for my whole life without even knowing it. Something in his voice, in the desperate sincerity of his eyes, made me nod. I helped him into the car. He settled into the back seat carefully, as if every movement caused him pain. He gave me an address in the financial district downtown, where all the big corporate buildings were. During the drive, neither of us spoke. I glanced in the rearview mirror every few seconds, trying to understand what was happening. He looked out the window with a distant expression, lost in memories I couldn't see. Traffic was heavy, as always at that hour. It took us almost 40 minutes to arrive. Finally, I stopped in front of a 20-story building with a glass and steel facade. It was the kind of place where important people worked, people with money. Alfred asked me to turn off the engine and accompany him inside. I hesitated. I still didn't understand what was going on, but I had come so far that turning back seemed foolish. I got out of the car and helped him down. We walked together toward the main entrance. The lobby was impressive, shining marble floors, glass walls, huge decorative plants in ceramic pots. A security guard behind a counter greeted Alfred by name with obvious respect. We took an elevator that smelled of expensive wood and luxury air freshener. Alfred pressed the button for the 18th floor. The doors closed, and we began to ascend in silence. I could hear my own breathing. My heart pounded fast. I didn't know if I was making a terrible mistake or if I was about to discover something important. The elevator doors opened directly into a private office. There was no hallway or reception area, just a dark wooden door with a gold plaque that read, Alfred Thorne, President. He took a key from his pocket and opened the door, ushering me in first. The office was enormous, floor-to-ceiling windows with a view of the entire city, an antique solid wood desk, bookshelves packed with leather-bound books, expensive paintings on the walls. Everything screamed success, power, wealth accumulated over decades. Alfred closed the door behind us and asked me to sit down. He pointed to a brown leather sofa near the windows. I sat down slowly, feeling completely out of place in my worn clothes and old shoes. He walked to a corner of the office where a large painting hung, a seascape in blue tones. He took it with both hands and moved it aside, revealing a safe embedded in the wall. It was old, the kind you see in old movies, with a combination dial in the center and green paint worn away by time. He looked at me before opening it. His eyes were moist again. He told me that what he was about to show me had waited 60 years for this moment, that he had promised to find the Vance family and fulfill a debt that had haunted him his entire life. Then he turned to the safe and began to turn the dial. Left, right, left. Again, I could hear the metallic clicks of the mechanism. My breathing had become shallow. I didn't know what to expect, but I felt my life was about to change in a way I couldn't yet comprehend. The safe door opened with a screech of rusty hinges. Alfred reached in and pulled out an old leather folder, worn at the corners. He placed it on his desk and motioned for me to approach. I got up from the sofa, my legs trembling. I walked to the desk and stood in front of the folder. He opened it carefully, as if it were something sacred. Inside were documents yellowed with age, black and white photographs, and what appeared to be antique stock certificates. Alfred took out a photograph and showed it to me. It was of two young men standing in front of a small building. One of them was clearly Alfred, probably 50 years younger, with black hair and a wide smile. The other man made me hold my breath. He was identical to me. The same eyes, the same nose, the same jawline. He was wearing work overalls and had one hand on Alfred's shoulder in a gesture of camaraderie. I asked him who he was, although I already knew the answer. Alfred confirmed what my heart already knew. That man was Hector Vance, my father. I sank heavily into the chair in front of the desk. My legs couldn't support me anymore. Alfred sat down too and began to speak. His voice was soft but clear, telling me a story he had kept for 60 years, waiting for the moment to share it. He told me that in 1965, he was a 30-year-old young businessman who had inherited a small textile factory from his father. The factory was on the verge of bankruptcy. He had made bad decisions, trusted the wrong partners, and suddenly found himself with enormous debts he couldn't pay. The banks had denied him all loans. Creditors threatened him with lawsuits. He was about to lose everything. One night, desperate, he went to a bar near the factory to drown his sorrows. That's where he met my father. Hector worked as a mechanic in a nearby garage. He was a simple, hard-working man with calloused hands and clothes stained with grease. But he had an honesty in his eyes that Alfred had never seen. They started talking. Alfred, drunk and desperate, told the complete stranger his whole situation. The debts, the creditors, how he was about to lose his family's company. My father listened in silence. Then he did something Alfred would never forget. He told him he had savings. Not that much, but something. Money he had been saving for years to buy a house someday. He offered that money to Alfred, a complete stranger, to save his business. Alfred thought it was a joke. Nobody did that. Nobody loaned their life savings to a stranger in a bar. But my father was serious. 2 days later, they met at a bank. My father withdrew $30,000 from his savings account and gave it to Alfred in cash. $30,000 in 1965 was a fortune for a mechanic. It was literally everything my father had. Alfred, overwhelmed by the generosity, promised him he would not only repay the money with interest, but that he would give him 30% of the company's shares. Once the situation improved, my father would be an official partner. They signed a simple, handwritten agreement on a paper napkin. My father said nothing more formal was needed. He trusted Alfred. He believed his word. Alfred used that money to pay the most urgent debts. With the financial breathing room, he was able to renegotiate with other creditors. He secured new contracts. The factory not only survived, it began to prosper. Within 6 months, it was generating profit. Within a year, it had doubled in size. Alfred went looking for my father to keep his promise. He went to the garage where he worked. They told him Hector Vance had quit 2 months earlier. No one knew where he had gone. Alfred searched everywhere. He went to the address he had on file, but the house was empty. He asked the neighbors. No one knew anything. It was as if my father had vanished off the map. He hired private investigators, placed ads in newspapers, offered rewards. Nothing worked. Years passed, and Alfred never stopped searching. His company grew, becoming one of the largest textile corporations in the country. And with each passing year, the value of that 30% stake grew and grew. But Alfred never sold those shares. He kept them in this safe, waiting for the day he could find Hector Vance or his family. 60 years of searching, and today, by pure chance, I'd gotten into his car. He had seen my face and immediately recognized the features of his old friend, the man who had saved his life when no one else would give him a chance. Alfred opened one of the documents in front of me. It was a stock certificate in the name of Hector Vance, 30% of Thorne Textiles, Inc. Then he pulled out another, more recent document, a statement of the share's current value. When I saw the numbers, my vision blurred. It couldn't be real. I couldn't be seeing what I was seeing. $32 million. That was the current value of the shares that belonged to my father. $32 million that had been waiting in that safe for 60 years. I couldn't process those numbers. They couldn't be real. It had to be a mistake, a cruel joke, an elaborate scam. But the documents were there, official, with legal seals and accountants' signatures. Everything was legitimate. Everything was real. My hands trembled as I held the paper. The letters swam before my eyes. Alfred watched me in silence, letting me process the information at my own pace. I tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. My throat was tight. I felt like I couldn't breathe properly. I sat back down in the chair because my legs had stopped working. $32 million. I, who had been surviving on $100 a month for months. I, who ate beans and cheap bread every day. I, who lived in a miserable closet-sized room, was suddenly a millionaire. Alfred came over and placed a hand on my shoulder. He asked if I was okay, if I needed water or something stronger. I shook my head. I didn't need water. I needed to understand. I needed to know why my father had never told me any of this. Why had he disappeared without claiming what was his? Why had he died a poor man when a fortune was waiting for him? Alfred seemed to read my thoughts because he started talking before I could ask. He told me that over all these years, he had thought about it a lot. He had developed theories about why my father disappeared. Maybe he was afraid of so much money. Maybe he didn't trust the business world. Maybe something personal forced him to leave the city quickly. Maybe he was simply a man who valued his peace of mind more than wealth. Alfred never knew the answer, but what he did know was that Hector Vance had been the most honorable man he had ever met, a man who gave everything he had to help a stranger without asking for anything in return. I asked him why he had kept the shares all of this time, why he hadn't sold or used them after so many years, and no news of my father. Alfred smiled sadly. He told me he had made a promise, that a man without his word was nothing. He owed all the success he had achieved, all the money he had accumulated, everything he had, to my father. Without that $30,000 in 1965, he would have lost the family business. He would have ended up on the street. My father had given him a second chance when no one else would. The only way to honor that was to keep his promise, no matter how much time passed. He showed me more documents, records of dividends that had accumulated year after year, financial reports that showed the company's growth decade after decade, photographs of the factories expanding across the country. Alfred had built a textile empire. Thorne Textiles now had 43 factories in 8 countries, employed over 20,000 people, and generated hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue annually. And 30% of all that had always belonged to my father. I asked him why he had recognized me so easily. 60 years had passed since he last saw my father. Alfred laughed softly. He said he had never forgotten that face. For decades, he had looked at the photograph he showed me at least once a week. He had memorized every feature of my father. When he saw me standing by his car, it was like seeing Hector Vance resurrected. The same eyes, the same facial structure, even the same way of tilting my head. It was impossible not to recognize me. He knew immediately that I had to be his son. Alfred walked toward a window and looked out at the city below. He told me he was 85 years old and had been sick for the last 2 years with lung cancer. Doctors gave him maybe 6 months more to live. He had lost hope of finding the Vance family before he died. But destiny, or God, or whatever it was, had put my car exactly in that place. Exactly at that moment. It was a miracle. The last chance to fulfill the promise he had made 6 decades ago. He turned to me with tears in his eyes. He told me I didn't know how much weight had been lifted from him. That for 60 years, he had carried that debt like a stone in his heart. That every success of his company felt incomplete because he knew he hadn't been able to repay the man who made everything possible. Now he could finally rest in peace. He could die knowing he had kept his word, that the Vance family would receive what always belonged to them. I didn't know what to say. Emotions overwhelmed me. I felt gratitude, confusion, sadness, joy. All mixed in an impossible whirlwind. I thought about my father, the man I thought I knew. He had been a mechanic all his life. He worked with his hands until his health wouldn't allow it. We always lived modestly, without luxuries, but always with what we needed. He never spoke of this story. He never mentioned Alfred Thorne, or any textile company, or any money owed to him. He died without claiming this fortune. He died peacefully, surrounded by his family, in a simple hospital bed. And I never knew he had been a hero to someone. I told Alfred about my father, about how I remembered him. A quiet, hard-working man, of few words, but strong character. A man who taught me and my brothers the value of honest work, who always said the most important thing in life wasn't how much you had, but how you treated others. He raised us with discipline, but also with love. He died 30 years ago, without me knowing he had once done something as extraordinary as saving an entire company with his life savings. Alfred listened attentively. When I finished speaking, he nodded slowly. He said that sounded exactly like the Hector Vance he remembered. A man who didn't need recognition or reward, who did the right thing simply because it was the right thing, who valued his integrity more than any amount of money. Those kinds of men were rare. Perhaps that's why he had disappeared without claiming the shares. Maybe he never cared about the fortune. Maybe he just wanted to help someone in need and then continue with his simple, honest life. Alfred called his secretary on the intercom. A middle-aged woman named Faye entered the office with a tablet in her hands. Alfred gave her instructions in a low voice. She nodded and left again. He explained that he was contacting his legal team, that they needed to make an official transfer of the shares to my name, that the process would take a few days due to all the required documentation, but that he would ensure everything was done correctly. He also told me I could sell the shares if I wanted, keep them, and receive dividends, or any combination of both. It was completely my decision. I couldn't think clearly. $32 million. The figure kept repeating in my mind like a broken record. I thought of my miserable room, my job as a rideshare driver, my sons who had abandoned me, the last 6 months of suffering and humiliation. All that had ended in an instant. My life had completely changed in less than an hour. But the strange thing was that what I felt most wasn't happiness over the money. It was deep sadness for my father, for not having truly known him, for not having known about his heroism while he was alive. Alfred seemed to understand. He told me that what my father had done for him wasn't about the money. It was about character, about kindness, about the willingness to help another human being in their darkest moment. That couldn't be bought or sold. That was Hector Vance's true legacy. And that legacy lived in me because I was his son. I had his blood, his features, probably many of his qualities that I hadn't yet discovered. The money was just the physical manifestation of a moral debt. But the true fortune was knowing I came from such an extraordinary man. I asked him if I could keep the photograph, the one of my father and him in front of the factory. Alfred smiled and immediately gave it to me. He said he had copies, that this photograph had been on his desk for 60 years, that he had looked at it thousands of times, remembering the friend who saved his life. Now, it was only fair that I have it. I took it with trembling hands and looked at it closely. My father, so young, with his whole life ahead of him, smiling sincerely at the camera. He didn't know at that moment that he had just changed someone else's destiny. He didn't know that decades later, his act of kindness would still have repercussions. He was just being himself, a good man doing a good thing. Faye returned to the office, followed by an older man in a dark suit carrying a leather briefcase. Alfred introduced him to me as Stephen, his personal attorney and the company's legal director for 30 years. Stephen greeted me with a firm handshake and looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and respect. Alfred quickly explained the situation. Stephen nodded as if this was something he had been expecting for years. I realized then that he probably knew this story too. That probably many people in Alfred's inner circle knew about the outstanding debt to Hector Vance. Stephen opened his briefcase and took out several documents. He explained in a professional but kind voice that they would need my official identification, proof of residence, birth certificate, and my father's death certificate to process the legal transfer of the shares. They would also need to conduct DNA testing to confirm, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that I was Hector Vance's son. It was standard procedure for transfers of this magnitude. It wasn't that they doubted my identity, but legally, they had to cover themselves against any possible future challenge. I told him I understood, that I would do whatever was necessary. Stephen smiled and told me the complete process would take about 2 weeks. In the meantime, Alfred had authorized an advance to cover immediate needs, $50,000, which would be deposited into my bank account the following day. I nearly fell out of the chair. $50,000 was more money than I had ever seen together in my life. Stephen handed me bank forms to fill out with my information. My hands trembled so much I could barely write. Alfred rose from his chair with effort, leaning on his cane. He walked toward me and extended his hand. When I shook it, he placed his other hand on top, forming a warm, two-handed clasp. He looked me directly in the eyes and said something I will never forget. He told me his life had been blessed the day he met my father, that everything good that had happened to him after that encounter in the bar he owed to the generosity of a mechanic who had no obligation to help him, that he had spent 60 years wishing he could look Hector Vance in the eye and say thank you, that he couldn't do that anymore, but that he was saying it to me. Thank you for being the son of that extraordinary man. Thank you for showing up when he had lost hope. Thank you for allowing him to die in peace. My voice broke when I tried to respond. I told him I was the one who should be thanking him, that I had no words to express what I was feeling. Alfred shook his head. He told me not to thank him, that this wasn't generosity on his part, it was justice. It was fulfilling a promise. It was paying a debt that should have been paid 6 decades ago. He had only been the custodian of something that always belonged to my family. I spent the next hour filling out forms and answering Stephen's questions. My father's date and place of birth, names of relatives, all the genealogical information I could provide. Stephen took meticulous notes on his tablet. He explained that he would immediately launch the legal investigation to ensure there were no other heirs who could claim the shares. I told him I had 2 sons, Moses and Earl. Stephen wrote down their names and asked if I wanted to include them in the transfer. I was silent for a moment, thinking of them, of how they had treated me, of how they had kicked me out of my own home without remorse. I told Stephen no, that the shares would be transferred home only to my name, and that I would decide later what to do with the inheritance. Stephen nodded without judgment and noted my decision. Alfred watched me from his chair. I think he understood there was pain behind that decision, but he didn't ask. He simply nodded in silence, as if giving me his support. When we finished the paperwork, Alfred insisted that Faye drive me back to my car, which was still parked in front of the hospital. I protested, saying I could take a cab, but he wouldn't take no for an answer. He said he had waited 60 years, and the least he could do was ensure I got home safely. Faye was efficient and kind. During the drive, she asked if I was okay, if I needed to stop anywhere. I thanked her, but told her I just wanted to get back to my car. When we arrived at the hospital, and I saw my car parked in the patient pickup zone, I realized something surreal. Just 2 hours ago, I was a desperate rideshare driver picking up passengers to survive. Now I was a potential millionaire. Nothing had changed physically. The car was the same, I was the same, but everything was completely different. Faye handed me a business card with Stephen's direct number and told me to call him if I had any questions or needed anything. She wished me good luck and left. I stood next to my car for several minutes, unsure what to do. People were going in and out of the hospital. Ambulances arrived with sirens blaring. Life continued normally for everyone but me. I took out the photograph Alfred had given me. I looked at my young, smiling father. I tried to imagine the moment he decided to give all his savings to a stranger. What went through his mind? If he was afraid, if he hesitated, or if he simply saw someone who needed help and acted without thinking too much because it was the right thing to do. I got into the car and sat in the driver's seat with my hands on the wheel. My phone buzzed with notifications from the app. Trip requests were waiting. People who needed transportation. I looked at the notifications, then at my father's photograph. I thought about everything that had just happened. Alfred crying when he saw me, the old safe, the yellow documents, the $32 million, my miserable life of the last few months, my sons who abandoned me, Patrice, who wasn't here to see this. I started the engine and drove back to my room. Traffic was heavy, and the sun was beginning to set. The city lights flickered on one by one. I thought about how, in a few weeks, my life would be completely different. I could buy a house, a new car, decent clothes, real food. I could quit working. I could live the rest of my days with dignity. But the strange thing was that none of those things excited me. The only thing I felt was a deep hole in my chest, a sadness for my father, for not having truly known who he was, for not having been able to tell him I was proud of him while he lived. I reached my building when it was already dark. I climbed the stairs to my third-floor room. I opened the door, and the smell of dampness greeted me as always. I turned on the light and looked around. The messy bed, the dirty hot plate, the stained walls. Everything looked even more miserable, now that I knew I would be leaving forever soon. I sat on the bed and placed the photograph on the table. I looked at my father for a long time. Finally, I spoke aloud, though no one else was in the room. I said, "Thank you. Thank you for being who you were. Thank you for your kindness. Thank you for giving me this gift without even knowing it. Thank you for teaching me by your example, even though I didn't understand it until now." I lay on my bed and put the photograph of my father on the bedside table. I stayed up for hours trying to understand who that man really was. The simple mechanic I knew was only part of the story. There was another dimension to him I had never seen, a man capable of giving everything he had to help a stranger. A man whose act of kindness had traveled across 6 decades to find me in my darkest moment. The hours passed slowly. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Alfred's crying face, the yellow documents, the impossible numbers. $32 million. The words repeated in my mind like a prayer. I got up several times to check my wallet, to confirm I had Stephen's card, that everything had been real and not a dream concocted by desperation. I made instant coffee on the hot plate as the sun rose. It tasted awful, but it was all I had. At 9 in the morning, I called Stephen. He answered on the second ring, his voice professional, but kind. He asked how I was and if I had rested. I told him the truth, that I had barely slept. He laughed softly and told me it was completely normal after receiving such shocking news. He confirmed that the $50,000 advance would be deposited into my account that day before noon. He asked if I had an active bank account. I said yes, although I barely had $1 in it. Stephen asked me to come to his office that afternoon to begin the formal documentation. I needed to bring my official identification, my birth certificate, if I had it, and any document proving my relationship with Hector Vance. I had very little: my worn ID card, an old birth certificate I had kept for years for no particular reason, and some photographs of my father from when I was a child. Stephen assured me that would be enough to start, that his team would take care of obtaining the death certificate and other necessary official documents. I spent the morning organizing the few important papers I had. They were stored in a dusty shoebox under the bed. I found the birth certificate, folded and yellowed with age. I found old photographs of my childhood, of Patrice when she was young and beautiful, of my sons when they were smiling babies. I found my father's ID, which for some reason I had kept after his death 30 years ago. Seeing it, I felt a knot tighten in my throat. There he was, younger than I remembered, looking seriously at the camera with those eyes I now saw every morning in my own reflection. At 11:30, my phone vibrated with a bang notification. A deposit of $50,000 had been credited to my account. I stared at the screen, unable to process what I was seeing. I refreshed the app 3 times to make sure it wasn't a system error. The money was there, real, available. I could withdraw it if I wanted. $50,000, which 24 hours ago would have seemed like an impossible fantasy. I left the room and walked to the nearest bank. I needed to see it with my own eyes, to confirm it physically. The branch was 6 blocks away. I entered nervously, sweating, despite the air conditioning blowing hard. I stood in line, waiting my turn. When I finally reached the window, I asked the teller to check my balance. She typed on her computer and then looked at me with an expression completely different from usual, more respectful, almost deferential. She confirmed the exact amount, $50,215. The $215 was the miserable balance I already had. I asked to withdraw $1,000 in cash. She processed the transaction without asking questions and handed me 10 crisp, new $100 bills. I left the bank with that money in my wallet, feeling like the whole world could see the change in me, even though externally I was still the same old man in worn clothes and broken shoes. I walked down the main street, observing everything with new eyes: the stores, the restaurants, the people shopping without worries. Everything seemed different now that I had cash in my pocket. I entered a restaurant that I had always seen from the outside, but where I had never eaten because the prices were too high for my budget. I sat at a table by the window. I ordered a full breakfast without looking at the cost: scrambled eggs with ham, crispy bacon, buttered toast, freshly squeezed orange juice, real coffee served in a porcelain cup. When the food arrived, I had to fight back tears. I hadn't eaten anything like that in months. The taste of the salty bacon, the hot, aromatic coffee, the soft, perfect eggs. Everything tasted like a blessing, like recovered dignity. After breakfast, I walked to a clothing store. I needed something decent to wear to Stephen's office that afternoon. I couldn't show up in the same old, stained clothes I had worn during months of misery. I bought a dark gray dress shirt, a clean ironed white shirt, and black shoes that weren't broken or worn out. The total was $210. A week ago, that expense would have destroyed my entire month's budget. Now I barely felt it. I paid in cash and left the store with the bags in my hand, feeling a strange mix of relief and guilt for spending money on myself. I went back to my room and changed clothes. I looked at myself in the small, cracked mirror hanging crookedly on the damp wall. In new clothes, I looked different, more dignified, less defeated, less invisible. But I was still me, The same man who had been living in absolute poverty. The same man whose children abandoned him without looking back. New clothes didn't change the pain, but it was a start, a first step towards something better. I took a taste of Stephen's office. It was in the same imposing building where I had been the day before with Alfred, but on a different floor. The elegant receptionist was waiting for me with a professional smile. She led me directly to a large conference room with a mahogany table and leather chairs. Stephen was already seated with several documents organized in front of him. He greeted me warmly, as if we were old friends, and had me sit in the main chair. We spent the next 2 hours reviewing endless papers. He patiently explained each document before I signed it. Affidavits, official identification forms, authorizations for exhaustive genealogical investigations, consents for DNA testing. Everything had to be perfect and legal, so that no one could challenge my right to the shares in the future. A medical technician arrived in the mid-afternoon to take my DNA sample. It was quick and painless. A swab rubbed inside my cheek for 30 seconds, and that was it. Stephen explained that they would compare my DNA with samples they would obtain from old medical records of my father. The hospital where he died 30 years ago kept files on all deceased patients. It would be enough to confirm, without any doubt, the direct genetic relationship. The results would take about a week to process. In the meantime, Stephen and his team had begun to investigate my father's history in depth. They had found old employment records showing that Hector Vance had indeed worked as a mechanic in various city garages between 1960 and 1980. They had found his marriage certificate with my deceased mother. They had found our birth certificates, mine and those of my 2 deceased brothers. Everything perfectly matched, the story Alfred had told, with tears in his eyes. There was no fraud, no mistake. Everything was completely legitimate. Stephen asked me about my current situation, with genuine concern in his voice. I told him everything, without omitting painful details, about Patrice and the cancer that took her in 3 months, about Moses and Earl kicking me out of my own home to sell it, about the miserable room I lived in for $300 a month, about working as a ride-share driver at 73, just to be able to eat every day. He listened in absolute silence, nodding occasionally with a serious expression. When I finished my story, Stephen leaned forward and told me something that filled me with hope. He told me that all that suffering would end very soon, that in 2 weeks at most, I would have full and legal access to the inherited shares. He explained that I could sell all of them if I wanted immediate liquidity, sell only a part, or keep them entirely and live off the generous annual dividends. He explained that the annual dividends for that share package were approximately $2 million every year. $2 million annually without having to sell anything, without touching the principal capital. $2 million a year. I, who had lived on a $400 a month Social Security check. I, who had eaten beans and bread for months to survive. I couldn't process those numbers. It was as if they were speaking to me in another language. Stephen must have noticed my look of shock because he stopped and asked if I needed water or a moment to process the information. I nodded, and he called his assistant to bring cold water. I drank slowly, trying to calm my racing mind. Stephen waited patiently, without pressuring me. When I finally regained some composure, he continued explaining the options. He strongly recommended hiring a trustworthy personal financial advisor. He gave me a list of names of 3 professionals who worked with high net worth clients. People who could help me manage the fortune intelligently and protect it from bad decisions or scammers who would inevitably appear when they learned of my new situation. He also warned me about something important. He told me not to make hasty decisions driven by the emotion of the moment, not to buy big things immediately, not to tell too many people about the money yet, and to let the reality sink in for a few weeks before making drastic changes in my life. He explained that he had seen cases of people who inherited fortunes and lost them in months by making stupid decisions too quickly. He didn't want me to be one of those sad stories. I thanked him for the advice and promised to be careful. Then I asked him something that had been bothering me since the day before. I asked about Alfred, how he was after our meeting, if it had been too much for him emotionally, considering his delicate health condition. Stephen smiled sadly, but also with a sense of peace in his eyes. He told me Alfred was better than he had been in years, that the cancer continued to advance relentlessly, but that he could now face death without that enormous weight on his conscience. He told me Alfred had called his family the night before to tell them the news, his children and grandchildren. He had told them the whole story of Hector Vance and how he had finally found his family after 60 years of constant searching. He had cried tears of happiness on the phone. He had told them he could now die in peace, that he had fulfilled the most important promise of his life. Stephen told me that Alfred was deeply grateful to me for showing up exactly when I did, that he considered it a miracle, the answer to 60 years of desperate prayers. I asked Stephen to tell Alfred something from me, that I, too, was grateful beyond words, that I perfectly understood what he had done by keeping that promise for 6 decades, that honoring his word in that way was something extraordinary and rare in this world, that my father had chosen well, whom he helped that day in the bar. Stephen promised to convey the message word for word. I left the office around 5 in the afternoon. The sun was still shining brightly in the clear sky. The city buzzed with heavy rush-hour traffic. Thousands of people returning to their homes after work. I walked aimlessly for a long time, just thinking about how my life had completely changed in less than 48 hours. How my father's act of kindness 60 years ago had traveled through time to rescue me in my darkest, most desperate moment. It was as if he had somehow known that one day I would need that gift, as if he had planted an invisible seed that was finally bearing fruit decades after his death. I stopped at a small bar and sat on a bench under a large tree. I took out the photograph Alfred had given me. I looked at my young father, smiling next to his friend. 2 men who didn't know they were creating a story that would last a lifetime. I thought of all the times I had seen my father working in the garage when I was a child, his hands always dirty with grease, his clothes stained, his back bent over engines. He never complained. He never talked about sacrifices. He simply did his job day after day with silent dignity. Now I understood that this humble man had been capable of such great generosity that he had saved another person's life. And he never boasted about it. He never mentioned it. He simply continued living his simple, honest life. I wondered why he never claimed the shares, why he disappeared without seeking what was legally his. Alfred had speculated that maybe he was afraid of the money, that maybe something personal forced him to leave the city quickly. But I knew my father better than that. I believe he simply didn't care about the fortune. He had helped Alfred because it was the right thing to do, not because he expected a reward. And when he saw that Alfred was fine and the company was prospering, he probably felt his job was done. The money was never the point for him. That made me reflect on myself, on what kind of man I was compared to my father. I had spent the last few months feeling like a victim, blaming my sons, complaining about my luck, sinking into self-pity. But my father had faced difficulties with grace and generosity. He had given when he didn't have to give. He had helped when he could have looked the other way. That was the true legacy he left me, not the money, but the example of how to live with honor. The sun began to set, painting the sky orange and purple. I got up from the bench and walked back to my room. For the last time, I climbed those worn stairs. For the last time, I opened that door that led to my temporary prison. I looked around the miserable room, the sunken bed, the stained walls, the dirty hot plate. In 2 weeks, I would be out of there forever. But strangely, I no longer felt hatred for that place. It had been my refuge when I had nothing else. It had kept me alive during the darkest months. I sat on the bed and looked at my father's photograph again. I spoke to him aloud, though I knew he couldn't hear me. I told him I finally understood that I had lived my whole life without knowing who he truly was, that he had given me a gift that went beyond money. He had shown me that true wealth lies in how we treat others, in the kindness we leave in the world, in the promises we keep even when no one is watching. I promised him I would try to be worthy of his legacy, that I would use this gift in a way that would make him proud. That night, I slept better than I had in months, not because I knew I was rich, but because I finally understood something important about my life and the man who gave me life. I dreamed of my young father working in the garage. In the dream, he turned to me and smiled. He didn't say anything. He just smiled with that calm expression he always had, as if he knew a secret the rest of the world ignored. The following days passed in a strange haze. I was still living in the same miserable room, but now with $50,000 in my bank account. I was still the same person, but everything had changed internally. I felt different. I walked differently. I no longer shuffled my feet with my head down. I looked forward with something I hadn't felt in months: hope, recovered dignity, a future worth living. Stephen called me every couple of days to keep me informed of the progress. The DNA results had arrived. 99.9% positive confirmation that I was Hector Vance's biological son. The legal documents were being processed by notaries and corresponding authorities. Everything was proceeding as planned. In 1 more week, maybe 10 days, the shares would be officially transferred to my name. Then I could decide what to do with them. I spent those days thinking a lot. I walked around the city for hours, reflecting on my life, on the decisions I had made, on the people I had been, on who I wanted to be with this second chance life was giving me. I constantly thought about my sons, Moses and Earl, and how they had treated me. Part of me wanted to call them and rub my new fortune in their faces, to show them I had done well despite their abandonment. But a wiser part of me knew that would be petty and small. It wasn't what my father would have done. One afternoon, almost 2 weeks after meeting Alfred, Stephen called me with news. His voice sounded serious, but with a tone of sadness that made me fear the worst. He told me Alfred had passed away peacefully that morning at his home, surrounded by his family. The cancer had finally won, but Stephen assured me that Alfred had died happy. He had fulfilled his promise. He had found the Vance family. He had paid his debt. His last words had been of gratitude toward my father, and toward me for showing up when I did. I hung up the phone and cried. I cried for a man I had barely known for an hour, but who had completely changed my life. I cried for the friendship he had had with my father 60 years ago. I cried for the promise kept for a lifetime. I cried for the goodness that still existed in this world despite everything. Alfred Thorne had been an extraordinary man, and I had had the privilege of knowing him, even if briefly, before he departed. 3 days later, Stephen summoned me to his office for the final transfer. I arrived early, dressed in the new clothes I had bought weeks ago. The receptionist led me to the same conference room where we had worked before. Stephen was there with 2 other lawyers and a public notary. On the table was a perfectly organized stack of documents. Everything was ready. All that was missing was my signature in the designated places. We spent an hour signing papers. My hand trembled slightly with each signature. The notary constantly verified my identification. The lawyers explained each document before I signed it. Property transfer deeds, updated stock certificates, tax documents, bank authorizations. It was overwhelming, but Stephen patiently guided me through every step of the process. Finally, everything was complete. The Beschlussment signed and the Kabitz certified. Everything legal and official. Stephen handed me a thick leather keyder with all my original documents. He told me that officially, I was now the owner of 30% of Thorne Textiles, Inc., one of the main shareholders in one of the largest textile corporations in the country. He explained that the board of directors would want to meet with me soon to formally introduce themselves, that I could attend shareholder meetings if I wanted or appoint a representative, and that I would have a voice and a vote in important company decisions. But most importantly, I had options. I could sell the shares immediately. Several buyers had already expressed interest in acquiring them. The current market value was $32 million. But I could probably negotiate more. Or I could keep the shares and receive the annual dividends he had already mentioned, $2 million every year, without touching the principal capital. Or I could do a combination, sell a part for immediate liquidity, and keep the rest for long-term passive income. I told Stephen I needed time to think, that the decision was too big to make impulsively. He completely agreed. He again recommended I contact one of the financial advisors on his list, saying they could help me structure an intelligent plan based on my life needs and goals. I promised him I would. I left the office with the leather folder under my arm, feeling the weight of what it contained. Not the physical weight, but the emotional weight. Those papers represented the culmination of a story that began 60 years ago. They represented my father's sacrifice, Alfred's gratitude, a promise kept across decades, and now, all that rested in my hands. It was my responsibility to honor that legacy. I walked to a nearby park and sat on a bench. I opened the folder and looked at the documents. My name was written on each one. Leopold Vance, owner of millions. It was surreal. A month ago, I was driving a cab 12 hours a day to buy beans. Now, I was a millionaire. But the strange thing was that I didn't feel uncontrolled euphoria. I felt something deeper. Responsibility, gratitude, a desire to do something meaningful with this gift. I thought about what Alfred had told me that first day, that my father had valued his integrity more than any amount of money, that he had helped without expecting a reward. That was the real message. The money was important, of course. It would give me security and comfort for the rest of my life. But the truly valuable thing was the example my father had left. The lesson on how to live with honor and kindness, even when no one is watching. I took out my phone and looked at my contacts. There were the names of Moses and Earl. My fingers hovered over the screen. I could call them, tell them everything. Part of me wanted to see their reactions, to see if they regretted how they had treated me, to see if they suddenly wanted to be my sons again, now that I had money. But I put the phone away. It wasn't the time. First, I needed to decide what kind of man I wanted to be with this new life. Did I want to be someone who used money to seek revenge and create division, or someone who used it to heal and create something good? I remembered something Patrice used to say, that the true measure of a person is not how they behave when they have everything, but how they behave when they have lost everything. I had lost everything. I had hit rock bottom. I had lived in poverty and despair. Now that I was rising again, I had a decision to make. I could become someone bitter and vindictive, or I could become someone better, someone worthy of my father's legacy. The sun was beginning to set when I finally got up from the bench. I carefully put the folder back in my old backpack. I walked back to my room for the last time. Tomorrow, I would start looking for a new place to live, something dignified, something that reflected my new reality. But tonight, I would sleep one last time in that room that had kept me alive during the darkest months, as a farewell, as the closing of a painful but necessary chapter of my life. The next morning, I woke up early with a mental clarity I hadn't felt in years. I knew exactly what I needed to do. First, get out of that miserable room. Second, contact one of the financial advisors Stephen had recommended. Third, and most difficult, decide what to do about my sons. But that would come later. First, I needed to establish my new life on solid foundations. I called the first advisor on the list, a man named Robert Sanford, with 30 years of experience managing large estates. His assistant scheduled an appointment for that same afternoon. Then I searched online for apartments for rent in decent areas of the city. I found a furnished 2-bedroom in a modern building with security. It cost $2,500 a month. 2 months ago, that price would have seemed impossible to me. Now it was perfectly reasonable. I called the owner, and we agreed to meet the next day. The meeting with Robert was eye-opening. He was a man in his 50s, bald, wearing glasses, with a clear and direct manner of speaking that I liked immediately. He didn't use complicated language or try to impress me with technical terms. He spoke to me like an intelligent human being. I told him my entire story from the beginning. Patrice, my sons, the miserable room, Alfred, the shares, everything. Robert listened without interruption. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and thought for a moment before speaking. He told me I had 2 main options. The first was to sell all the shares immediately. That would give me approximately $32 million in cash. With a conservative and diversified investment, I could live comfortably the rest of my life with an annual income of approximately $1.5 million without touching the principal capital. The second option was to keep the shares and live off the $2 million annual dividends. The benefit was that the value of the shares would continue to grow over time. He recommended a third option, which was a hybrid. Sell 50% of the shares for $16 million in immediate liquidity. Invest $10 million conservatively to generate passive income. Keep $6 million as an emergency reserve and for important expenses. And keep the other 50% of the shares to continue receiving $1 million in annual dividends. That way, I would have the best of both worlds: immediate financial security, but also long-term growth. The proposal made perfect sense. I told him to proceed with that plan. Robert began to explain the next steps. He would contact potential buyers for the shares. He would negotiate the best possible price. He would structure the investments into a diversified portfolio of bonds, index funds, and real estate, all designed to minimize risk while generating constant income. He told me the process would take about a month to complete fully. During that month, my life changed in ways I never would have imagined. I moved into the new apartment. It was beautiful, clean, bright, with large windows that let in the sun. I had a real kitchen where I could actually cook, a private bathroom with constant hot water, a comfortable bed that didn't dig springs into my back. For the first time in months, I slept through the entire night without waking up in pain. I bought new clothes, not expensive, branded clothes, but decent and comfortable clothes. I bought real food, fresh meat, vegetables, fruits, things I had forgotten existed. Every meal felt like a small celebration. I regained the weight I had lost. My face no longer looked gaunt and gray. When I looked in the mirror, I saw a version of myself I thought I had lost forever. But with every small luxury I allowed myself, I thought about my sons. Moses and Earl knew nothing of my new situation. They still thought I was a poor old man driving a cab to survive. Part of me wanted to keep it that way, to leave them in their ignorance. But another, larger part knew that eventually I would have to face them, not for them, but for me, to close that painful chapter somehow. One afternoon, I received an unexpected call. It was Earl, my younger son. His voice sounded uncomfortable and forced. He asked how I was. It was the first time he had called me in 4 months. I told him I was fine. There was a long silence. Then he said that he and Moses had been talking, that maybe they had been too hard on me, and that they wanted to invite me to dinner to talk. My heart skipped a beat. I wanted to believe he was sincere, that they had genuinely regretted their actions. But something in his tone made me doubt. I accepted the invitation. We agreed to meet at a restaurant the next day. I hung up the phone with mixed feelings, hope mixed with cynicism. I wanted my sons to love me for who I was, not for what I had. I decided not to mention anything about the money at that dinner. I wanted to see their true intentions. I arrived at the restaurant 10 minutes early. It was a modest Mexican food place we used to visit when they were children. That gave me some hope. Maybe they had chosen that place specifically because of the memories. Moses and Earl arrived together 5 minutes later. They looked uncomfortable. We greeted each other with awkward hugs and sat at a table in the back. The first few minutes were superficial conversation. The weather, traffic, unimportant trifles. Then Moses took a deep breath and began to speak. He told me they had been thinking a lot, that maybe they had acted hastily after Mom's death, that they understood it had been difficult for me too. Earl nodded, adding that they felt some guilt about how they had handled the house situation. I waited. I knew something else was coming. And it came. Moses said they had thought of a solution. That if I needed a place to live, they could rent me the service room at Earl's house for $50 a month. They could help me that way. It would surely be better than where I was now. Earl quickly added that, of course, I would have to help with some chores. Nothing heavy, just light things like yard work or washing the car occasionally. I felt a cold stillness settle in my chest. There it was. It wasn't real repentance. It wasn't filial love. It was convenient guilt, mixed with the possibility of cheap labor. They were offering me to live in a service room as my own son's domestic employee. They thought they were being generous, that they were doing me an enormous favor. I looked at both of them. I saw their expectant faces. They were waiting for gratitude. They expected me to dissolve into thanks for their magnanimous offer. I felt a strange calm take hold of me. I smiled and told them I appreciated the offer, but it wouldn't be necessary, that I had found a decent place to live. Moses frowned, asking how I could afford it with my Social Security check. I simply told him I had gotten lucky, that things had recently improved for me. Earl asked what I meant by that, if I had won the lottery or something. He laughed, as if it were an impossible joke. I didn't laugh. I told them, in a quiet voice, that I had discovered something about their grandfather, Hector. Something we never knew. Something that had completely changed my life. Their expressions changed from condescension to curiosity. Moses asked what I was talking about, and then I started to tell them the story of Alfred, the bar in 1965, the $30,000, the shares saved for 60 years, the $32 million that were now mine. The silence that followed my words was absolute. Moses and Earl stared at me with their mouths open, unable to process what they had just heard. $32 million. The words floated in the air between us like something impossible. Earl was the first to speak. His voice came out shaky, asking if I was joking. I told him no, that it was completely real, that I had all the legal documents to prove it. Moses leaned forward, his eyes shining. He started talking fast, almost tripping over his words. He said it was incredible, that the family had received a huge blessing, that we had to celebrate, that we needed to make plans on how to manage all that money together as a family. Earl enthusiastically agreed, adding that they could help me manage it, that I shouldn't worry about anything, that they would take care of me and the fortune. I watched them talk faster and faster, making plans, suggesting investments, mentally calculating how much they would get, and I felt a deep sadness in my heart. Not sadness for me, but for them, for what they had become, for how money had instantly transformed their contempt into false affection. 5 minutes ago, they offered me a service room as charity. Now they wanted to manage my fortune as a united family. I raised my hand, interrupting them. Silence fell again. I told them in a calm but firm voice that I needed them to hear something important, that when you kicked me out of my house 4 months ago, when you told me to find an apartment with my miserable Social Security check, when you abandoned me without looking back, I hit rock bottom. I lived in a closet-sized room that smelled of dampness. I ate beans and bread for months because it was all I could afford. I worked 12 hours a day as a rideshare driver at 73 just to survive. I told them that in all that time, in those 4 months of absolute suffering, I didn't receive a single call from them. Not a message asking how I was, not even on your mother's birthday, which passed 2 months after her death. Nothing. Total silence. You had erased me from your lives, as if I had never existed. As if 40 years of being your father meant absolutely nothing. Moses tried to interrupt, but I continued. I told them that today, when you called me after 4 months, I had hope. Stupid hope that maybe you had genuinely repented. That maybe you missed me. that maybe you wanted your father back. But no, you offered me a service room in exchange for domestic work, as if I were an employee and not your father, as if that were generosity and not additional humiliation. Earl began to stammer excuses that I didn't understand, that they had good intentions, that it was hard for everyone. I raised my hand again, stopping him. I told them I understood perfectly, that actions speak louder than words, and their actions over the last 4 months had shown me exactly who they really were. Moses changed tactics. His voice became pleading. He said they had made mistakes, that they were human, that they deserved a second chance, that we were family, and family forgave. I nodded slowly. I told them he was right, that family should forgive, but that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting, nor did it mean pretending nothing had happened. True forgiveness required genuine recognition of the harm caused and real change in behavior. I told them I didn't hate them, that maybe with time I could forgive them, but that right now I needed distance. I needed to build my new life without the toxicity of relationships based on material interest. I told them they wouldn't see a cent of that money, that it was my inheritance from my father, and I would decide what to do with it. And my decision did not include rewarding them for abandoning me in my most vulnerable moment. My sons' faces transformed. The mask of repentance fell away, revealing fury underneath. Moses slammed his palm on the table, making the silverware jump. He said it was unfair, that they were my children, that they had a right to a part of that inheritance, that legally they could fight for it. I remained calm. I told them that legally they had no right, that the shares were exclusively in my name, that my lawyers had already ensured that, and that they could try to sue if they wanted, but they would only lose money on legal fees. Earl tried a different approach, a soft voice and moist eyes. He said he regretted everything, that if he could go back in time, he would do things differently, that he loved me and the money didn't matter. He just wanted his father back. I wanted to believe him. God knows how much I wanted to believe him. But I had learned something important in those months of suffering. Words are easy. Actions show the truth. And their actions for 4 months had been total abandonment. I got up from the table. I took out my wallet and left enough money to cover my share of the check that we never ordered. I told them I hoped that someday they would understand that what my father taught me by his example was not about accumulating wealth, but about surviving with integrity, about helping others without expecting reward, about keeping promises even when no one is watching. That was the true legacy I had received. The money was just a symbol of something much bigger. I told them the doors weren't closed forever, that if they ever showed genuine repentance, if they demonstrated with actions and not just words that they had changed, maybe we could rebuild something, but that it would be on my terms, not out of obligation or for money, but because they genuinely wanted a real relationship with me. I walked out of the restaurant without looking back. I heard Moses yelling something behind me, but I didn't stop. I got into my car, a new one I had bought the week before, and drove back to my apartment. For the first time in months, I felt free. Free from expectations. free from the need for approval from people who didn't deserve it. That night, I sat on my balcony with a cup of real coffee, looking at the city lights. I thought of my father, of Alfred, of the promise kept for 60 years, of how an act of kindness can travel through time, creating ripples that touch lives decades later. My father never knew that his generosity would eventually save me, but it did. And now it was my turn to decide what to do with that gift. I decided to create a foundation in my father's name, the Hector Vance Foundation, dedicated to helping seniors in need. People like I had been just months ago, homeless, hopeless, abandoned by their families. We would give them dignified housing, food, medical care, but above all, dignity, because I had learned that losing your dignity hurts more than losing your money. And not all the money would go to the foundation. I would live comfortably. I would travel. I would enjoy the years I had left. But a significant portion would be dedicated to continuing the legacy of kindness that my father began 60 years ago in a bar when he gave everything to a stranger without a second thought. Some debts are too great to pay with just money, but sometimes money is the only way left to say thank you. Thank you, Dad, for teaching me that true wealth is not in what you accumulate, but in what you give. Thank you, Alfred, for keeping your promise when it would have been easy to forget. And thank you, life, for giving me this second chance to live with purpose and meaning. I will dedicate the rest of my days to honoring the legacy of two extraordinary men who showed me that kindness never dies. It only waits for the perfect moment to blossom. Did you like my story? And which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. If you liked the story, you can support me by sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I'm looking forward to your comments on the story. On the screen, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend. There's so much more on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story. With love and respect.